Welcome everybody to our webinar. We're going to talk about leading indicator forecasting and more specifically the project we are doing with Solvay. I will shortly introduce myself and our guest, introduce Solventure and our leading indicator forecast methodology. Then I will hand over to Christian Backaert from Solvay, who will basically explain how Solvay is using leading indicator forecasting in improving its forecast accuracy. Let's start indeed with the introduction. So I'm very happy that Christian is able to join us. As you can see, he has more than 20 years of experience in various roles in the supply chain. He is currently part of the Supply Chain Excellence Department, and with Supply Chain Excellence, looking for which initiatives do we have to move forward on the supply chain maturity within Solvay. And as Christian will explain, leading indicator forecasting is something they are actively looking at when it comes to improving forecasts or improving maturity in the forecasting domain. Myself, I'm CEO of Solventure. Over the, let's say, last 5 to 6 years, we've done research on leading indicator forecasting, and over the last 3 years, we've been building our own software product around that, and I'll basically introduce more in the next few slides. So who is Solventure? Well, as it shows here, we are experts in sales and operations planning. Sales and operations planning is the traditional steps of sales and operations, so demand and supply and inventory balancing. We also heavily rely on segmentation, so don't use the same service level for all customers and for all products. You need to differentiate. Also, product management is very important for us, so how to come to good forecasts for NPIs and how to stop all products in time, how to do good end-of-life management and keep control of the complexity in your product portfolio. That's also an essential step, and rolling everything up into exec S&OP is essential to get executive buy-in of, let us say, important decisions. How do we do S&OP? As you see, we combine process, tools, analytics, and people. So we have a good knowledge on how, for instance, forecasting processes work in different sectors. That's something which we bring to the table. Forecasting in a project-driven environment is completely different from forecasting in FMCG environment, which is promo-driven, or is different from a traditional business-to-business environment where the one-on-one customer product combination relationship could be quite dominant. We have learned that if you want to improve S&OP, you also need good tools. The process comes first, but if you keep trying with Excel, you will get stuck in the process. So we are using a tool which is called Arqiva. As you see here on the right, Arqiva is an American software. We are their channel partner into Europe. So basically, when projects start from Europe, we are in the lead for the project. Arqiva is listed by Gartner in the Magic Quadrants of S&OP, both the systems of record and the systems of differentiation. So it means it has both a very good basic capability as it has good differentiation or advanced capabilities. Analytics is important to us. As you will see, leading indicator forecasting is based on statistics. We have quite some engineers. Myself, I'm a mathematician from basic training. So for us, analytics is a turbocharger. If you have a good working process and a good tool, you easily get 30-40% extra performance out of the engine by providing good analytics. But analytics is also a matter of precision. So we need to really master analytics if we want to use it in a correct and good way. And in the end, people, that's an open door. You can have the best process and the best tool and the most clever algorithms, but if the planner is not trusting the outcome, he will not use it. So accounting for change in projects is key, and it's also something, let's say, which is close to the way we run our projects and how we get in people involved from the start of the project. At the center here, you find our supply chain triangle of service, cost, and cash. So the essence of SNOP and anything we do is balancing that triangle, because in our experience, companies struggle with that. And the reason to balance that triangle is basically a financial reason. If service is driving top line or sales turnover, then the combination of the service and the cost gives a margin. And it's not only about the margin, it's about the margin you generate over the invested capital, over the cash employed. And that's actually here the return on capital employed, or ROCE. So that ROCE, or that triangle, it's also written down in a book I've published last year. That's very close to everything we do as Solventure. We are going to talk today more specifically about live leading indicator forecasting. So in the SNOP vision, live or leading indicator forecasting is something which you could say see as a next step in the forecasting process, and which can help you to improve your forecast accuracy beyond the current capabilities, so to speak. And the current capabilities would be a traditional statistical forecast and a good collaborative process. It's based on PhD research. Actually, we started, I think, even 7 years ago by having some master theses on this subject. Then I had a first PhD student on the subject, Gillian, which is currently our researcher in the team, is continuing PhD research on this topic. And in the meantime, we have developed our own software product, which is called Live or Leading Indicator Forecasting, which basically brings it to companies and gives that power of the leading indicator forecasting into your hands, as we will also see from the case Solvay later on. What's the idea? Well, the idea is that we gather data on what is influencing your demand. So we look at demand drivers. It originally started from macroeconomic factors. So the basic idea is, if I'm selling into automotive or if I'm selling into construction, there's a lot of indicators on how automotive is doing, how construction is doing. Can I get information from these macroeconomic factors? But in the meantime, we have extended our database with other data like weather data. We certainly have also seen that, for instance, more in FMCG, calendar effects can be very important. Also, events are very important. I think we will come up with examples. For instance, we know that in China, it's a very event-driven market. If it's the policy making of the Chinese government which makes that your sales is significantly increasing or decreasing. So if you want to come to a good forecast, our philosophy and belief is that you need to gather information on what is driving your demand, about demand drivers. And basically we have built statistical models which can link your sales data to these demand drivers. This is just a couple of databases we are connecting to. So connecting to the data, all of this is currently freely available data. Well, somebody needs to do the work to build all of the connectors and pull all the data into one database. That's an investment that we have done, and that's also what we bring to our customers. And then the rest is basically advanced statistical modeling, because if you now have 2 or 5 or 10 million indicators, how do I then find the indicators which are relevant for my business, for my forecast? That's really where most of the PhD research has gone into. So here again, we collect external data. You can also have internal data. Lots of companies buy data from market research companies. So there's well-known research agencies for the automotive who also make public or make available forecasts on where the automotive industry is going over the next few months and years. You can also include your internal data. We typically take sales data either from your existing forecasting system or from your ERP system. So we need to get that data out, and either you export the result and you manually integrate with your existing planning system, or we can also automatically integrate with that existing planning system. And it's a cloud-based tool, so once we give you access, you would see it's very easy to use and to manipulate. Before we come to the case of Solvay, I want to share 2 extra topics. Just in brief again, what's the methodology? How does it work, leading indicator forecasting? I have a case from another company I also want to share, which explains a little bit how does it work and how do we work with companies when it comes to leading indicator forecasting. And then Christian will explain how he has been using it at Solvay, why they are investigating and so on. Let's start with the methodology. So the basic thing we try to do different is the following. In this sales, which is here the black line, you see there is at some point in time an upward trend, then it's declining, then it's getting upward again. So there are so-called turning points or inflection points. So there is a first inflection point here at the first dashed line, and there is a second inflection point at the second dashed line. The problem with traditional statistical techniques is that they simply extrapolate. So if I'm here at the first inflection point and my sales has been increasing with 5% over the last few months or the last few quarters, traditional statistical techniques will simply extrapolate that trend into the future. Also, at the second inflection point, if my sales has been decreasing with 5 or 10% month on month or quarter on quarter, traditional techniques will simply extrapolate that downward trend into the future. How the traditional forecasting world works is that we say, if we know that there is some uncertainty in the market, what we do is, instead of relying on the traditional techniques, we revert to the expert. So we will ask the sales manager, or we will ask the product manager on, there seems to be some uncertainty here. What is it going to be? What is your expectation? But what we have seen in a lot of cases is that also people work like traditional statistical techniques. If your sales has been increasing with 5% month on month, and if you ask somebody what is going to be the forecast, he will simply extrapolate and will say it's plus 5%. Or if the sales has been declining with 5%, people are very tempted to extrapolate and predict a minus 5%. Here we really want to come through a breakthrough by the use of leading indicators. So the question is, if I look at a certain time series, and a time series could be, I have a certain product group in a specific region. I have something which is related to automotive in Europe or in the US or in China. The question is, can I find indicators who help me to better turn the corners? Are there indicators which predict me, you will be here at the end of your increase and your sales will start declining? Right? Or vice versa, you are at the end of the decline here and your sales will start increasing. So the question is, can we find leading indicators that help us to better turn the corners? And of course, we are looking for indicators that are leading. We look for leading indicators. So I'm looking for indicators where I say, well, I can see here that I reached a peak in the indicator and the indicator started going down. And I know that a couple of months later that will result in a peak in my sales and that my sales will decline afterwards. Or vice versa, if I see here in the indicator that I've reached the bottom and the indicator starts increasing again, I know that a couple of months later, also my sales will bottom out and I will see a launch in my sales again, or a kind of a revival. So can I find indicators with a significant lead? And the lead preferably is, I don't know, anywhere between 3, 6, 9 months. You can have a lead of 1 month, but that's really short term. If you have global supply chains, you prefer to have a lead of 3 months or 4 months or 6 months or 9 months. And yes, we are able to find that type of indicators with that type of leads. We will show examples later on. Leading indicator forecasting for sure has started here more on the tactical horizon. So the idea was to improve the tactical forecast. 6 to 12 months out. If it's a tactical forecast, we are not talking about individual customer product combinations. No, we are typically talking about product groups. It can be a higher level of product aggregation or a somewhat lower level of product group aggregation, and typically also split per region. Because the way the European market is going could be different from the way the US market is going, or the way China is going, or Russia is going. So we look at product groups which have a typical application, maybe automotive, or maybe construction, or maybe furniture, or maybe footwear. So different product groups with different applications, and we also look at regions. How can I use that tactical forecast on an operational level? Well, then you need to do a breakdown. You will need to break down that aggregated forecast into a lower level forecast. Arqiva customers do this in the Arqiva software, right? If you would have a different forecasting software, typically we would give you the aggregated forecast, and in your existing forecasting system, you would break down the aggregated forecast into a lower level forecast based on historical demand, or a lower level forecast which you have made earlier. Especially in Arqiva, this is very easy because Arqiva is very good in doing that type of aggregation and disaggregation. The leading indicator forecast as a tactical forecast can also be helpful to come to a strategic forecast. Why? Well, by better understanding the demand drivers on a tactical level, I also know which things I need to look for when making a strategic forecast. If you really want to forecast 2, 3, 5, 10 years out, we have not yet found indicators which are 24 months or 36 months or 48 months leading. No, we have found indicators 12 months out, 18 months out, but at some point in time, if you want to look into the far future, you will need to rely on forecasts. The question is, which forecasts do I need and which forecasts do I need to buy? Well, if you have done that tactical leading indicator forecasting exercise, you have a much better understanding of what are your demand drivers. So you are also in a much better position to then make your strategic forecast. Yeah? If, for instance, we would know that the tactical forecast is driven by oil production, and oil production has a 6-month lead. Yes. Well, if you would have a forecast of how oil production will be continuing into the future, you would also be able to project your forecast further into the future, right? So that's a bit where do we position it and how does it couple back to the operational forecast and to the more strategic forecast. Before I hand over to Christian, let's look at the case study. And this is a case study from a steel company. And when we started the exercise, well, typically the reason why companies start the exercise is that they say, well, last year we had a change behavior in the sales. So I don't know, either last year the demand turned out to be way lower than we had initially anticipated, or last year in Q2 and Q3 the demand was much stronger than we had initially anticipated. But it typically starts when companies feel that they don't really understand what is driving their demand. And the traditional statistical forecast didn't capture it, and also the salespeople, for one reason or another, did not capture it. So that's a typical starting situation. And then of course, if we start this type of exercise, people have assumptions. So in this case, the assumption was, we believe that our demand is driven by oil price. Why? Because part of our products are going into the oil industry, oil field industry. So before we start an exercise, there's typically a lot of assumptions on what are the demand drivers. Two things to add there is that, like, on the one hand, when we do this type of exercise, there's a couple of goals. We want to make sure that any assumptions you have today are being put on the table, that we can use statistics to either prove or disprove. Yeah? Because a lot of this goes, let us say, by tradition. Well, maybe your sales was linked to oil price 10 years ago, but we should also realize that since people started doing fracking in the US, the oil price has collapsed. So maybe there was a historical dependency on the oil price, but that dependency is no longer there. So we want to bring up the assumptions, and we want to use statistics to validate your assumptions. That's a clear goal. A second goal is that, well, maybe you have overlooked things and your assumptions are not complete. That was actually the case over here. You will see it. So by using what we call the brute force statistics, starting from correlation analysis and using advanced statistics to build models which seem to predict your time series quite well, maybe we are able to reveal or identify drivers which you were not yet aware of. So that's something which is also important in the exercises that we do. I've also noticed that throughout the last 2 to 3 years, we gain a lot of expertise on, for instance, how automotive works. And in general, we have, for instance, seen that if you are looking for drivers, don't use the oil price, but instead of oil price, use oil production. Why? Oil price is also driven by speculation. So you have huge swings in the oil price. And a big part of it is done with speculation. If you look at oil production, well, scaling up or scaling down, oil production is a slower process. And we have already seen that oil production in general is a better indicator to use than oil price. So that's also a type of expertise we bring to the table. So let's continue with this specific example. So what we see on the left, let's start on the left. We see the black time series is the original sales. So you see the original time series, there's lots of peaks. The goal of leading indicator forecasting is to forecast the underlying trend. So the first step we really do is, if the black series is your sales, we take off the events. And what could be events? Events could, for instance, be calendar seasonality, right? So this, for instance, could be December, and this downward peak could also be December. Yeah? If all my customers stop ordering because they want to deplete their inventory by the end of the year, yeah, then I know that December will also always be a bad month for me. So the first thing we do is we take off events. Calendar seasonality, any known events. Certainly if you go to the Chinese market, a lot is driven by regulation, so you need to model the regulations to get rid of some of the variability and to be able to reveal the underlying trend. The red curve here is the underlying trend. Yeah, so the red curve is the underlying trend. It is what we get if we remove seasonality and any noise in the time series. Leading indicators is used to match this trend, the red curve. Okay, if we try to match that red curve, let's start with the oil price. If we look at the oil price, well, certainly we see here that my sales declined rapidly, and at the same time the oil price also declined rapidly. So in the second half of my time series here, there seems to be a good fit between what did my sales do and what did the oil price do. The oil price here has already been lagged over 4 months. So the original oil price would be 4 months earlier. We have shifted the oil price by 4 months to better reveal, let us say, the match with the trend. It's good for the second half here of my graph, but it doesn't seem to provide a good match with the first half of my graph. Yeah? If I look at the oil price here in the first half of my graph, oil price is going up and down. There seems to be a slightly increasing trend in the oil price, but in any case, the oil price is not making the huge swings that my sales is doing. So maybe the oil price could be used as an indicator for the second half, but it's certainly not useful, or it does not explain the variance in the first half of my sales series here. So what did we do in this case? We start with correlation analysis. We build statistical models, let us say, with some brute force. And what we saw in that correlation analysis, that a lot of indicators popped up which were related to exchange rates. Yeah? And especially the exchange rate for the euro against the dollar. And it's not something that this company had expected or anticipated, but when we do the same exercise and we look at the exchange rate of the US dollar against the euro, well, we see that on the one hand here in the second half of the time series, we again get to a quite good match. And so the decline in my sales also is well predicted by the change in the exchange rate. And it's again with a lag of 3-4 months. So we have already shifted the indicator. But in the first half, I now also see that the exchange rate seems to better match the upward and downward cycle I see in my sales. So assumption was the oil price. Don't use oil price, use oil production. But at the same time, we saw here, oil price, oil production, it's not fitting the first half of the time series. When we start using the statistics, we see a lot of things related to exchange rate coming up. If we use the exchange rate US dollar versus the euro, we see that we get a much better fit. So what happens? Well, if you don't use leading indicator forecasts, if you don't use leading indicators, this is what you get. So if we take out 6 months and we make a forecast for the last 6 months, this is the error month per month, and this is the weighted error. So with traditional techniques, you get to 16.6%. The method used here is ETS. And ETS is not that common in commercial software, but it's a quite advanced benchmarking technique in the academic world. What do we see? If we would use the oil price as an indicator, basically we are in the first column here. If we use the exchange rate as an indicator, then we are in the second column here. So in general, if we use leading indicators, but you could say the wrong ones, we already see an improvement. If we use the right indicator, being the exchange rate, we see an even bigger improvement. Actually, by using indicators here, you can see we halve the error. So we go from 16.6 to less than 8%. So we more than halve the forecast error for this time series. And this is not a one-off example. Certainly when there are quite some trend changes, we know that traditional techniques cannot predict a change in the trend. They cannot predict or turn corners. Leading indicators forecasts are especially meant to do that. So it's also logical that we come to a significant improvement here. What else do we see? Well, what you can see here is basically this is the history. So this is again our historical sales. And let's assume that we are somewhere over here, right? So we are, I think, at the end of Q3 in 2015. Then we try to make a prediction for the next year. So we are over here, we try to make a prediction for the next year, and we do that using different techniques. The green one here is called ARIMA. ARIMA is one of those other commonly used statistical techniques, traditional statistical techniques. We also see here Holt Winters. So Holt Winters is a statistical model that knows trend and knows seasonality, but it doesn't use leading indicators. So what we would see here is that Holt Winters here goes down the drain. So Holt Winters takes the recent trend and extrapolates it downward. ARIMA, for some reason or another, predicts an upward trend, but you can see that ARIMA is actually overstating the sales because the real sales is over here. The real sales is relatively flat. You can also see the leading indicator forecast. So the leading indicator forecast is this line here. So it's even visually clear that leading indicator by far gives the best forecast. Not only does it give the best forecast, there's more to it. A leading indicator forecast typically also gives more stability, because now you need to look at what happens if we take the same time series and we make a new forecast if we are 2 months later. So this is the same time series, but instead of putting ourselves here, this is somewhere second half 2015, we put ourselves in a position where we are 2 months later. So here, ARIMA was still giving an upward trend and Holt Winters was predicting a downward trend. If we are 2 months later, see what happens. Holt Winters is still predicting a downward trend, And ARIMA now all of a sudden is also predicting a downward trend. So what you also see with those traditional techniques is that sometimes they predict an upward trend, 2 or 3 months later they start predicting a downward trend. But if on an aggregated level you predict an upward trend or a downward trend, you create huge swings in your forecast. And that's also where forecasting gets a bad name, because huge changes in the forecast create unnecessary nervosity in the supply chain. Basically, you are creating your own bullwhip effect here. And what you see if you look at the leading indicator forecast is that leading indicator forecast is actually much more stable, right? So you see that the leading indicator forecast, it seems to be scaling down a little bit, but 2 times it predicts a relatively flat trend, so to speak. Again, it's logical that the leading indicator forecast is more stable. Why? Because it's based on actuals. So if I have an indicator which is leading 6 months out, then the forecast for the next 6 months is based on actual observations of the last 6 months. If I'm 3 months later, I will have 3 new observations of my leading indicator, but 3 are still there. So half of the weight is still based on the same observations of my leading indicator. So automatically we get forecasts which are not only more accurate, but which are also more stable. And those are, of course, 2 key advantages that companies get when they start using leading indicator forecasts. And that was it as an introduction. I'm now happy to hand over to Christian to explain what he has been doing with Solvay and us.
So thank you, Bram. So now you have no more secret about what is leading indicators, and I will present you a test case that we did and that we finalized only a few days ago with Solventure, because we are piloting and we wanted to see whether this technology, this new approach in forecasting is delivering interesting results for us. So I will start by presenting you in a few words the Solvay Group, then also bring this project into the context before going to the results of the study and also the lessons learned from that experience. So a few words about Solvay. So Solvay is a Belgian group based in Brussels, but with a presence all over the world. So we are covering all the regions. We are present in 61 countries. You see also the number of sites, which is rather large, and gives you already a view on the complexity we have in the group. Also to give you a flavor of the different markets we are covering, and this has changed over time. So in the last 5 years, we went through a global revision of our portfolio, acquiring a number of businesses, selling also other businesses, and where industrial application was traditionally the main segment. Now you see that we have a kind of equilibrium around 20% for 3 segments, which are automotive and aerospace, consumer goods, and industrial application. So you see that in terms of markets, we are covering a large spectrum. So we are organized by different businesses. So we have 11 different business units. Each business unit has its own operations, managing their own S&OP. And they are grouped in 3 different segments. The first one that you see is advanced material. So advanced material is developing a material that will impact, for instance, sustainability in the mobility, CO2 reduction, or energy efficiency. You have a second segment, we call it advanced formulation. And advanced formulation is actually business that are working on what we call surface chemicals and also liquid behaviors. If I take the case of Novecare, you see shampoo. So we are bringing a number of additives, a number of liquids in the shampoo that are giving specificities to the product. We have another business called Aroma that is producing vanilla aromas. So you see, again, we have a very large panel of businesses and products. Now to give some words about the context in which we decided to make a test with Solventure. So we started a journey 4 years ago, approximately, implementing a new tool in SNOP in all the different business units, and we have installed the tool now in a big part of the business unit, but we still need to continue this implementation. And obviously, together with the tool implementation, we go for a revision of the process. And we started testing and using statistical forecast 3 years ago. Because the tool offered the possibility to do it. So today we have, let's say, mixed feeling about statistical forecasting. It's not used everywhere as it could be, and probably this is also linked to the transformation that we still need to do. Nevertheless, end of last year, we decided to test some application of demand sensing, and in this case is the leading indicators. Another point that we introduced a few months ago is the forecast accuracy dashboard that provides the visibility on the performances in terms of forecast accuracy, and I think this is very important. So what do we have? We have classically 3 ways to perform a forecast. We have what I call the classical way, where you ask your sales rep to put forecast, and this is mainly done at the lowest level, so material or SKU ship to level. It's a manual approach. Then we have the statistical forecasting that we run through the SNOP tool and during the SNOP process. Advantage, of course, it's automated. And now we are piloting the demand sensing. The fundamental change between leading indicators and statistical forecasting is that statistical forecasting, as Bram explained, is looking at the past, but is blind for the future, where leading indicator is the contrary. So in terms of scoping, the clear question in the group was, does that bring value? And you will see the answer to that question in a few seconds. In terms of scoping, we worked with one of our business units, which is technology solution, and we limited the scope to one of their business, which is polymer additives. And more than that, we scoped it for one customer segment, which is the automotive market. And we made the analysis region by region. So we considered the 3 main regions: Asia, North America, and EMEA. And you will see that we also obtain different results by region. So in terms of process, and I will not detail this too much because Bram explained it much better than me, but we start taking the data, we remove seasonality trends even to come to a smooth demand. Then there was a work to select the indicators, and this work is also something very important, because you need to feel confident in the indicators that will be selected, as Bram just explained with the previous case, where the exchange rate was probably not the most natural indicator to choose. That's also something we were confronted with, selecting the indicators. We wanted also to select indicators that would have the buy-in from sales. Then you apply it to the different segments, and you compare the results. So moving to the results. So here we are for the European market, and for this test case, we wanted to compare the past. Of course, we have already a view on the future, but to see whether this technique was generating results, we wanted to apply it to a data set in the past and compare it with our traditional way of forecasting. I asked Solvay to compare it also with statistical forecast, because statistical forecasting is till now not used within that business unit. So you see in so the red the red line is the sales on a monthly bucket, and you see three main changes in the trend, and it's very important to generate good results with leading indicator. You will see the results, but mainly when you have swings in the trends, that's where you get the best results with the leading indicators. So for this case, we selected 4 different indicators that you see here, and for each indicator you have a lag. That's the lead period, the number of months ahead of our market. The longer this lag, of course, the better it is, because you can then react to these changes in the market that now you can anticipate. Then you have the variance. This is the percentage of impact of each indicator in the total impact. So compared to the previous presentation on the steel industry, here we took the combination of different indicators, and this combination is giving a better result than taking each indicator individually. Then you have also the relation, that's the plus or minus that you see. A plus will indicate that if this indicator is increasing, then your market will increase as well. A minus is the contrary, so if the indicator is increasing, then it means there will be a negative impact on your market. So for this European market, comparing the results, so we were comparing live forecast, which is the leading indicators. We took the MAPE, so the mean absolute percent error as the reference, and you see that compared to our traditional method, we can improve by 20% the forecast accuracy. Looking at the best statistical model, there is a very similar percentage of improvement. So in this case, based on the different swings in the trends and on the long period that we considered, we have a very important improvement in the forecast. And when you realize the impact forecast has on your inventory and distribution cost, you imagine the value it can generate. Now, if we look at North American market, there we observe that leading indicators were not as conclusive as for the European market. And the explanation for that is that when you have removed events and seasonality, you see a rather flat demand pattern. And so the conclusion is that the classical statistical forecasting methods is delivering also good results. We didn't publish the Solvay results here, but I can tell you that both life and best statistical models were improving by far the results of the classical manual input. So that's a takeaway to say that if you do not have large swings in your leading indicator or in your demand, then leading indicators will not be that better than classical statistical methods. In this case, in our case, for that specific business, for that segment of the market, we are not using statistical models. So we can also consider using the leading indicators because the results are very similar to the statistical models. Now, looking at the third market we consider, which is China. China is a specific market where government is influencing sales by changing the taxes. And you can see clearly here that when they announce that there will be an impact in the tax, an increase in that case, we are increasing the sales a few months before, because we will register additional cars anticipating the higher cost. And this market is really made out of a number of events. So as Bram explained, it's very important to clean your data for those events. There we looked at the results again, and we see that in a classical approach, leading indicators are generating a much better results than the classical statistical forecasting. In this case, Alt-Winters was delivering the best results, and you see how poor those results are. Then if you clean the data, if you remove the information of the pre-buying approach due to tax impact, of course, for leading indicator, it remains the same percentage, but you improve statistical forecasting. But comparing the two, the conclusion is that leading indicator is still delivering a better results than the classical statistical forecasting methods. So lessons learned before we go for a Q&A session. The conclusion of the study we have made with Solventure, and I repeat, we just finalized the results a few days ago, is that it is delivering very good results. Not in all conditions, but when conditions are there, the results are really important. And it's most valuable when you have those trend swings. So I showed you the difference we have on the European market versus North American markets, and that's important to note. Another very important element is cleaning the data. So making that exercise is not simply taking your data, you put them into a software, you press the button, and you get the results. No. So you need to clean the data, you need to understand where you have those events that have influenced your market, you need also to spend time in analyzing the different indicators. I think this is really the role of a demand planner. And depending on your maturity, depending on your structure, this will generate good results or not. So it's not an exercise that is not taking time and just press the button approach, but it delivers really excellent results. Yes, Bram mentioned it, and I confirm that completely. Do not expect to have leading indicators giving you good forecast results at the level of SKU ship to combinations, because there you will have other elements that will influence your sales to one specific ship to. Just mentioning the price versus your competitors, and so you have much more short-term swings. So leading indicators will be applicable for a more aggregated level at the level of the market, and then depending on your situation, depending on your industry, you have to define a number of rules for disaggregation of this information to your SKU ship to level. So this is what I wanted to present you. Now, Bram, I think we open the door for questions.
Yes. So if you have questions, if you go to the GoToMeeting box, you can click on the questions, and there you can enter questions. Then we see it here on our screen. One question I think is already partly answered, Christian, but maybe you might give a short extra note on it. I think the question is, the leading indicator forecast is indeed on an aggregated level. How do you break it down? How do you get it to a level that is really useful for planning? So what would be your recommendation there?
Well, honestly, we haven't tackled that issue in details so far. But the idea that we have is that we look at the trends, and then we look at the deviations compared to the trends at the level of the SKU ship to. So if we see a clear upwards trend, and we see that for some of the customers there is a reduction of the forecast, then we will have a discussion with the sales rep why he considers there will be a reduction. So the idea is not really to press the button and have rules for the aggregation, but more to point out some differences that we will speak or detail with the sales rep. And that's probably a recommendation also that I didn't put on my slide, is that I think that leading indicator is good, statistical forecasting is good, and manual input is good, but the combination of the three is probably, depending on the case, depending on your market, the best approach. And so leading indicator shows clear results. It will have a big impact in terms of value, but don't think that you just press the button and you have the results. No, take also the information from your market, the information from your sales rep to go to that lower level, the more operational level.
Yes, I certainly am aligned to the thinking. And on the one hand, it's an extra source of information. So if the leading indicator forecast is going up and the other forecasts are going down, the fact that the two point out a different direction will lead to a different discussion. And if you would really want to automate it, when we in Arqiva, if we forecast seasonality, also seasonality, we don't do it on a customer SKU level. Seasonality, you try to detect on an aggregated level, for instance, on a product group level. So there again, seasonality, we would make a statistical forecast on the aggregated level. It's basically also on that same aggregated level that you could plug in a leading indicator forecast and then theoretically break it down. So there's different options, and it might also depend on how much trust do we already have in our company on using statistical forecasts. Do we more want to use it as a reference for discussion, or do we want to automate it? There's lots of questions coming up. That's excellent. I want to take at least one question, which is, the question here is, what if the market is relatively stable, but changes in the demand are due to changes in the market share? So if there's only 4, 5, 6 big players in the market and we divide the market, so maybe the market would be stable, but if we see changes in our demand, it's due to a change in market share. Well, in the last year, we have done also quite some analysis, not only on your sales, but also what is the total market doing. And the question will there be, do you have data, so from one or another trade association or so on, where you can get market data? So we can do this type of analysis on your sales. We can also do it on the total market. So we've done quite some analysis on the total market, and there again, if the total market is going up, we had a recent example, the total market was going up, but the sales of the company was going down. It's again an extra source of information, and then the question is, what's going on? How come that we are losing market share? What are we doing wrong? And it could even be a production decision, because if you say, I have limited capacity and I chose to prioritize another market over this market, but having more insights certainly leads to better conclusions. Question here, and maybe Christian, you can take that, and then we will almost need to close. So the questions that we were not able to answer, we will reply on email later on. How did you decide which leading indicators to use in the model? So maybe you can tell from your experience, how did we come up with the model, and what type of interactions did we have?
That's a good question. I think the best approach is test the different combinations and see the one that is generating the best results. For this pilot, we took another approach. So we were proposed a list of indicators, and we took the ones that are, of course, influencing or very close to our market, but those that we trust. And there is no objective link to it or explanation to this, but we said, okay, let's take indicators that are directly linked to our market, or for which we consider there is a directly link. Obviously, if we look at the steel case that you presented, probably we can still improve the results of our study by using indicators that we rejected. But that's also the learning curve that we need to make when we go further implementing this approach.
Yeah, and the last question I will take, and then we will need to close this. As from which horizon do you see added value? Is it month +1 or further? Our ambition has certainly been to be in the S&OP horizon, let us say 3 to 12 months out. We typically also see indicators 1 month out or 2 months out. In the S&OP horizon, that's typically less useful. You want to look out a bit further. But the same technique can be used, because Christian talks about demand sensing, but demand sensing more on the tactical horizon. You could use the same techniques to do demand sensing more on the shorter term. And I always need to tell that to Gillian, like, don't show month +1. Why? If you want to know the leading indicator for month +1, in a lot of companies, it's the order book. Yeah? If you look at the order book in the beginning of the month, you can typically already make a good forecast of what your sales will be by the end of the month. So it's not been our primary focus so far, but if your challenge would primarily be on the short term, well, the same techniques can be used, and typically it's easier. If you need to look out further, you need indicators with a longer lead. It becomes more difficult. If you can focus on the shorter term, it typically becomes more easy. So it's even better. So we'll need to finish here. So first of all, Christian, thank you once more for sharing the results and doing this exciting exercise with us. And I think after, if the webinar closes, there is a short survey. So we are always eager to learn. So feel free to fill in the survey and tell us what you like and what can be improved. And if you say, well, I'm impressed with what I have seen, I would be interested to do something comparable with some of the data of my company. So you can register for a free trial. We can explain you the process. But basically, like we have done with Christian, we can also see, can we prove added value for your company? And we would be more than happy to explore this. So thank you, Christian.
With pleasure.
Thank you, everybody. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.